Before we move to our distinguished panel, the folks who are here with all the answers, allow me to give a brief introduction of Indiaspora. Indiaspora is a not-for-profit organization that brings together a powerful community of Indian origin leaders from across the globe. Our members come from diverse fields and backgrounds, are all committed to making a difference and inspiring the Indian diaspora to be a force for good. Indiaspora creates spaces for collaboration, strengthens community ties, and help catalyze meaningful social change. As a nonpartisan organization, Indiaspora builds bridges between diaspora leaders and leaders in India, and our mission centers on promoting collective action worldwide. Through thoughtfully curated events such as this evening's conversation and impactful initiatives, we are bringing together a geographically, professionally, and generationally diverse community, unified in its drive to increase philanthropy, support innovation, and enhance civic and political engagement. Indiaspora's vision is a global Indian diaspora committed to creating lasting and positive change. Today's event is focused on the programmatic vertical of civic and political engagement. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our great interest in seeing more active interest in our community in civic and political engagement. And this election has given us a lot of reason to pay a lot of attention to this. And today our distinguished panelists, Niraj, Antani, Shekhar Narasimhan, Dhruva Jaishankar will be facilitated in conversation by Indiaspora's own Neha Dewan, our Senior VP of Operations and Legal Counsel. Neha, off to you.
Thank you so much, Shobha, and thank you for all of those of you watching, and especially our esteemed panelists, Dhruva Jaishankar, Shekhar Narasimhan, and Neha Gentani. And just a little bit about them. So Shekhar is the chairman and founder of the AAPI Victory Fund, which is a super PAC focused exclusively on building the political power of the AAPI community. And Shekhar has been a longtime Indiaspora member and enthusiastic supporter. He's been a great sounding board for us, a guide, and also a collaborator on a variety of strategic initiatives. In his business life, Shekhar is the managing partner at Beekman Advisors, which provides strategic advisory services to companies and investors involved in real estate, mortgage finance, affordable housing, and related sectors. And some fun facts about Shekhar. So he has not one, two, but three grandsons. And Shekhar, for your sake, I hope that they're not a handful. He has also served as a commissioner on President Obama's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And he was also the chair of Virginia's Housing and Community Development. So welcome, Shekhar. We have Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the executive director and founder of the Observer Research Foundation, or ORF, which is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization in DC, which is dedicated to addressing policy changes facing the US, India, and their partners. And notably, this is the first Indian affiliated public policy think tank overseas. So kudos to you, Dhruva. He's also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia and writes a regular column for the Hindustan Times. His research on India's relations with the US, Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia, and Europe, also research on defense and security policy, and globalization, democracy, and technology, they've all been published in several books, policy reports, and publications, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Survival. And a fun fact about Dhruva is that he has a forthcoming book out in December by Penguin India, which is called Vishwa Shastra, India and the World. So Dhruva will be sure to look out for that. And then we have Niraj Gentani. He is serving his first term as the state senator of Ohio, and he is also the youngest member of the Ohio Senate. He was first elected to office at the age of 23. And that was to the Ohio House of Representatives, and then age of 29 to the state Senate. He served 3 terms as the state representative in the Ohio House of Rep. He is the first Indian American state senator in Ohio history. He is also the youngest Indian and Hindu American state or federal elected official in the United States. He was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy in 2015. The conservative media organization Newsmax named him the second most influential Republican in the nation under 30. He's also received various awards for his work helping the veterans and people with disabilities. And among his proudest legislative accomplishments, he authored the state law giving college athletes the rights to their name, image, and likeness, commonly known as NIL. And a fun fact about Niraj is that he is an experienced balloon animal artist. So Niraj, I think we're going to book you for all in-person events coming. So clear your calendar for all of that. So thank you again for being here. Shekhar, I'll pose the first question over to you. As a leader in the Democratic Party, what changes do you expect in the U.S. domestic policies, affecting minority communities, especially regarding economic empowerment and social equity?
So first of all, I think we should all breathe a sigh of relief. It's over. Some of us may not like the outcome. I figured I'd wake up on Wednesday morning with a different outcome, but it is what it is. Look, we had free and fair elections. We have a peaceful transition of power underway. All these are what should be norms, and I'm glad that's what's happened. I do expect some pretty dramatic changes. Now, it depends to a little bit of an extent on whether the Republican Party gets the House, which appears likely but is not determined yet. But assuming that they hold a trifecta, namely the presidency, which Trump has won, the Senate, which they have won, and the House, then in a sense, they are the governing party and they get to do what they would like to do. In most cases, now there are checks and balances in the United States. So what do I expect? This election, like a few other elections around the world, saw the incumbent party, if you will, lose. And there's a lot of precedent for this in Europe and in other countries. And a number of the issues had to do with the similar issues to the US. So I do want to point that out. Immigration, the idea that people can enter this country and get temporary protective status, or depending on which side you're on, a humane policy or one where we're being overrun by migrants. The other issue is the economy and its inflation. We are in the phases of, the post-COVID era. Most countries have seen significant inflation. The United States did as well, among the highest in decades. And when people see inflation, a very famous economist said this, they go to the grocery store, they see the price of eggs and milk, and they say, I hate whoever the president is. The administration has to get blamed for that, irrespective of what it is. If you're taking credit for things, you should take blame too, But if they come back home and there's a letter in the mail or an email and they open it and it says you've just been promoted and got a big salary increase, they credit their hard work and the fact that they did it themselves. So this is human. It's what's happened all over the country. It's inevitable that a ruling party has to fight against the grain. We did, I think, very joyfully with Kamala Harris, the first South Asian woman to ever run for president and be the top of the ticket. But I think she fell short in a lot of different ways. And I don't think it was because of her hard work. So bottom line, I do see changes in immigration policy. I do see changes. We've been told that the changes will be in tariffs, which is to establish playing fields that are different than they are today. Those could be good. They could be inflationary. We'll see. We've been told they're going to be in taxes. There is a major tax reform package that has to be passed by the end of the year anyway. So I would expect it would be quite different than if Democrats designed it. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to be about immigration and what happens with regard to, are we going to see mass deportations in this country or not? That's what's been promised. Let's see what the results are. Very often there's a distance between what is promised in a campaign and what actually happens. Let's see how how distant those are or how close they are.
Thank you, Shekhar. And also, I think it's important to note, that you mentioned that there was free and fair elections, and we don't have, are not quibbling over that. So that's extremely important. Niraj, over to you. As a Republican leader, how do you view the election results affecting Republican priorities, particularly in relation to economic policies, immigration, border issues, and what might be the impact on the state level?
Well, look, I think Shekhar's right. It will depend on whether we have a trifecta or not with the White House, Senate, and the House. It's looking like we will have the House as Republicans. And if that's the case, look, I think this is a unique scenario that we have not seen since Grover Cleveland, where we have a former president becoming president again. with a 4-year gap. And so, this is more akin to a re-election of a president than a new president. We have a map of how President Trump is going to govern. If you look at 2017 through 2021, we know what is likely to happen. And so, obviously the challenges today are different. I think, challenge number one, like Shekhar said, is inflation. A lot of the Biden-Harris spending packages, like the America Rescue Plan, like the infrastructure bill, I think a lot of things you're going to see on sort of reining in federal spending and reducing federal spending, trying to get inflation under control. Number two, Shekhar also referenced this. It's the Trump tax cuts are expiring. I think you're going to see large in part those get extended. I don't know, exactly if it will be the 2017 version of the Trump tax cuts, but you're going to see some version of the Trump tax cuts expanded on an economic level. And then on the immigration side, I don't know that you will see much on the legal immigration side. There really wasn't much the last time President Trump was president, but this time I think you're going to see a lot on the illegal side. Yes, I think you're going to see a border wall get funded and border security getting funded. Number one. Number two, you're going to see an end to the TPS program, temporary protective status program, as it was in the Biden administration. It will likely be different, and yes, will likely cause deportations. And then third, I think you are going to see some of an effort to deport those that are in the country illegally, particularly those who have committed crimes, are committing crimes, et cetera. And so I think you'll see a lot of this happen, and I think those are the top priorities. I think obviously on a foreign policy stage, we'll see something happen with the war in Ukraine and Russia, and then the conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think President Trump will involve himself in those conflicts, and so I think there's a lot to do, and because of the trifecta, a lot of our ability to get things done. And look, I think as President Trump says, promises made, promises kept. He's going to want to deliver to reduce inflation, to have a healthier and better economy, and a resolve on the immigration issue. And so I think there's a lot of hard work to be done, and I think they will be doing that.
Right, and I think you mentioned the international angle with the wars, bringing in Dhruva with respect to that, with tensions ongoing in countries such as China and Russia. Do you expect any major pivots in U.S. policy, and what repercussions might this have for U.S.-India relations, particularly in terms of trade, defense, digital infrastructure?
Right. No. So just to set the context, I think a U.S. presidential election, and especially this one, will matter directly to 4 sets of countries. The first are U.S. allies, which are primarily NATO allies in Europe, Canada included, Japan, Australia, Korea, and others, where the U.S. has security commitments. It has extended deterrence in those places. And one of the things Trump has spoken about and been quite vocal about is that these allies need to do more, that that they need to burden share. So I think that this will have some direct implications for their own security policies. A second is U.S. adversaries, which are basically China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and they'll be observing this carefully. And I think it does make a difference whether this, even if Trump had won, whether this is a divisive election, whether he does, he doesn't, had he won by a small margin without a congressional mandate, it would have looked very different than had he had such a major victory, which would really consolidate his power over the next 4 years. A third group of countries are recipients of aid, particularly military aid, but also economic aid. That includes Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. But that sort of important support, they will be looking and seeing whether Trump will continue that. And finally, major trade partners, particularly export countries that are large net exporters to the United States, and Vietnam, Mexico. Now, India doesn't feature in any of those categories clearly, a little bit in that last one, and I'll get to that in a second. But these are the countries for whom the outcome of the election will have very direct ramifications, because both in terms of, Trump has advanced a vision of the United States and the world, which really is about rebalancing its alliance relationships and its trade relationships. Now, at the same time, there are a number of ongoing crises or geopolitical fault lines that are that will be first, foremost for the new administration. One obviously is the Ukraine war and what to do about it, and what negotiations will be involved with Moscow on an end state. A second is the Israel-Gaza conflict, where I think there's less ambiguity. I think there obviously Trump will be much more supportive of Israel and much more tough on Iran in particular. A third one, which is simmering, but which is in the back of everyone's minds, is the contest in the Indo-Pacific, particularly prospectively over Taiwan, but also equally the South China Sea, where the Philippines in particular, which is a US ally, is facing a Chinese revisionism. I would add a fourth theater here, which is the contest for the global South, where the US has tried, sometimes effectively, sometimes not, to exert influence and contest with, in some cases, China, some cases, Russia. Now, the reason I mentioned these four theaters is in all of these areas, this brings me to my last point, where does India play a role? And I think in all four of those theaters, the US will find that India can play quite a constructive role, potentially, in whether it is as a mediator or at the very least a channel of communication, maybe not going so far as mediation proper, or with Israel and others, where India is actually more supportive than a lot of other countries has greater convergence with the United States. And that gets me to my final point, which is bilateral relations between India and the US. I would anticipate we're in for some tough negotiations on two issues, trade and immigration, over the next 6 months to a year. I think a best case scenario is these are resolved in some manner that is mutually satisfactory, but it may or may not be. And a worst case scenario is particularly the trade issues linger over the next 4 years and unresolved. The first Trump administration came close to realizing something with India towards the end of his administration, but it was not carried through. But at the same time, as Prime Minister Modi, there are plenty of areas of opportunity as well in the bilateral relationship. And as Prime Minister Modi's message after his phone call to President-elect Trump indicated, he highlighted 4 areas, which were technology, defense, energy, and space, and he said, and others. But those 4 stood out as areas of potential collaboration going forward. So overall, when I look at this, I'd say India has not been directly impacted by this election. There wasn't a debate over India policy. You didn't see it featured prominently, which is a good thing. India can play a constructive role for the US in its major theaters of geopolitical competition. And in the bilateral relationship, I think if we were to find ways to manage the trade and immigration issues, there's a lot of prospective potential for the relationship.
I'll just follow up there, Dhruva. Would you say that this would be a serious pivot from what we currently have with the Biden administration? Because, with India being such a powerhouse, I don't think that it can be ignored or there wouldn't be serious changes. But would you see that there would be some of that in this administration?
I mean, I don't know if there would necessarily be a turnaround. I'd say broadly continuity, but I do think that there's a big difference in the emphasis of the two platforms, right? So, I wouldn't see a cooperation on clean and green energy. Well, we may see cooperation in the Quad, which was resurrected under Trump and continued and built upon by Biden. I doubt we'll see a clean and green energy working group in the Quad continue under a Trump administration. So that just reflects the different priorities that they'd have. We'll see a lot more cooperation potentially on fossil fuel energy, which is something else India needs. So again, I do think it's not that this election won't matter. There will be there will be differences, and the outcome does play a role. But I don't see I don't see this reversing the trajectory of the overall relationship. It will just mean a different issue set. Some areas of cooperation, some areas that were previously more cooperative. I mean, trade has grown massively under the Biden administration. India now enjoys a $30 billion trade surplus with the US. Now, the question today is, will Robert Lighthizer or other people around Trump say that India is not playing fair and subject India to tariffs? So again, I'm not saying that this will be may not always be smooth sailing, but overall, I think there'll be greater convergence then there are differences with India.
Thank you for that. And I think it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out, not just with India, but other countries that you mentioned with respect to the wars and also the countries that receive aid. So coming back to you, Shekhar, how might the election results impact, U.S. commitments to international agreements, such as climate change and human rights?
So I wanted to address something Dhruva made, which is he said, to a large extent, the relationship is so strong, so bipartisan, that the fundamentals of communication, dialogue, and advancement and trade are going to stay the same. I think there are some differences, though, that personally I find very stark, and I hesitate to say them completely aloud, but what ifs. So let me say them as what ifs. There are, in the group of this undocumented that have been so vilified during this election, there are roughly 725,000 Indians. They are people who came to this country either across the Mexican border, because there was, in fact, a pipe through Nicaragua, through Mexico, or they simply overstayed their visas, or they came on temporary visas, work permits, and didn't convert, or they are H-1B dependents that overstayed. It could be any category. They could be your father, your mother, your sister, your aunt, your cook, somebody you met on the street. What if in that undocumented, deportation of undocumented, 725,000 Indians are shipped back to India tomorrow or next year or over the course of 2 years? It has a significant effect on psyche, on what they will do when they get there, on jobs in India. I mean, it's a large number. It may not be as large as if you had to send 300,000 people back to the Dominican Republic in a smaller country. But I don't think that will be seen particularly favorably, if I'm guessing right, okay? So how does this occur? So that's one facet, for example. And I don't know if it'll happen. I hope it doesn't. But if it does, I cannot imagine it's good. What about tariffs? There's a clear and present danger of tariffs on certain goods, including service labor. As an example, you have that happen. It's not just going to cause issues here with labor when you add immigration, which will certainly decline, the removal of birthright citizenship, which, by the way, also affects Indians, etc. You will also have, in my view, some reduction in that trade because it's impossible to compete when you have 20, 30, 40% tariffs. China found it. So if China found it, why would India not find the same? Now, again, will all this happen? I don't know. All I know is that those don't sound very positive for the relationship long-term in all the facets we'd like. However, what there is a strong bond on a personal level between Trump and Modi. And that sometimes can overcome obstacles that aren't overcomable just by policy changes, okay? So I'm hoping, frankly, that bond overcomes some of these other things that are dictated by, I'm hoping some of that was just political rhetoric. I don't know. But if it isn't political rhetoric and actually happens, then whether it's, I will be answering a ton of questions about US-India relations that are very different than we're facing right now.
Yeah, and also, the rumblings on the ground in India have been that, President Trump would be better for India, and partly because, as you mentioned, the close relationship. So I think that will also be seen. Niraj, for you, on domestic issues, how might Republicans' goals for healthcare, women's rights, and family shape policies under the new administration?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think both Trump and Vance have I think in Republicans in Congress even have sort of understand repealing Obamacare is a tall order. And I think that remains to be the case. We saw in 2017 that, repealing Obamacare failed because of John McCain's vote. And it just shows how inordinately difficult it is. I think you may see parts of it reformed or repealed. And so I think that there will be efforts, on healthcare done there. But, and on other social issues, I think, look, the priority in the country right now is largely on the border and the economy. And so I think, you know, when you're talking about what the focus of Congress and what the focus for, you know, the White House may be, it is large in part going to be focused on inflation and the border. And so some of these, you know, more social policies will likely take, you know, more of a back seat than perhaps if a Democrat is in office, right? Democrats, we know, are sort of more akin to prioritizing these, you know, social issues. Obviously, there is, you know, much consultation and debate in a post-Roe v. Wade world, what, you know, abortion policy looks like on a federal level. I think, you know, that remains to be seen. There is a math problem there in the Senate that you really need 60 votes to do something significant in the Senate. We are maybe going to see 54, 55 max in the U.S. Senate for Republicans, which is short of that 60. And so I think, you know, abortion politics will certainly be prevalent, but I think it remains to be seen, you know, what can happen there. So I do think that, you know, social policies will take a backseat to the economy, to the border. But, you know, we have a good map of what happened in Trump's first term.
Right, definitely. And I think that, you know, like you said, promises made, promises kept. So, you know, economy and the border will certainly be, you know, to your point, one of the first things he tackled. I just want to note for everybody who is watching, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Would love to get a sense of what you're thinking as well. Dhruva, for you, you know, given your expertise in Indo-Pacific policy, how might the U.S. election results affect American engagement in the Indo-Pacific and the Quad Alliance? And what do you think are the implications for regional stability and India's role in this framework?
So, you know, I think really that's really a question about what will, I mean, for me, the biggest question, perhaps the biggest foreign policy question, which is unanswered, is what is China policy going to be going forward? And while it did take shape under the first Trump presidency, and in fact, in many respects, that thrust of that new China policy was continued under Biden, perhaps with more structure, more formal, and actually with bipartisan support in Congress as well. I still think there's some open questions and internal debate amongst Trump's advisors as to how to carry this forward. And essentially, as I see it, there are kind of four rough schools of thought on China. One is essentially a continuity of very traditional hawkish U.S. foreign policy. Some would describe it as hawkish. I think it's sometimes an unfair characterization, which sees this growing China-Russia compact and a contest with the U.S. for global influence. And I'd refer, if people are interested, a former Trump Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, and Mike Gallagher, who is a former congressman who was chair of the Select Committee on China in the House. They co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs which laid out in some ways a version of that argument. A second school of thought believes that China is the real long-term adversary for the U.S., and in some ways the U.S. needs to pull resources, particularly from Europe and to a lesser extent the Middle East, and focus those military resources in particular on the structural competition with China. And J.D. Vance, the Vice President-elect, has articulated something to that effect. Elbridge Colby, who's another advisor, is another very vocal advocate of that sort of rough school of thought. A third view, I would say, is a little bit more, for lack of a better word, isolationist, more politically driven, more about cutting U.S. commitments overseas. And you do see some people around Trump who are more on the political side of the foreign policy and national security establishment espouse some of those views, which would really lead to a U.S. sort of abdicating space in the Indo-Pacific. And then there's a fourth view, which is largely driven by business interests and financial interests that wants to see a stabilization of the U.S.-China relationship, a return to some degree of normal economic, normal Chinese investment in the United States, and vice versa, U.S. trade, bilateral trade, and so I think we'll see and a lot of Trump's donors, by the way, espouse this view, and he listens to them, and you see that reflected, for example, in debates on whether to ban TikTok or not, or to force it to be sold to a U.S. owner. So I think we will see a contest playing out in the next few weeks and months amongst the advisors as to which should be the and it'll be some combination of these worldviews, but which will take primacy in Trump. And from there, I think the rest of the Indo-Pacific policy will follow. My sense is that the Quad, in some shape or form, will stay. Again, it was revived under Trump in his first term, but the areas of emphasis and work right now, it is basically about 12, 13 working groups, which are across government. They cut across agencies, include not just the State Department, that are working on very specific concrete products and deliverables. And I suspect some of those will continue, some of them won't. And we may have some additional legs to it. The impulse in the first, under Mike Pompeo and others in the first Trump administration, was to make it much more of a strategic coordination mechanism of the four countries, and two, kind of a signaling mechanism to China. So we may see some return of that. But again, I do think the Quad will remain. I think it'll be shaped based on the priorities of the Trump administration.
And Dhruva, just to keep on you for a second, there's a question from Sunil Kumar Singh, who's asking, what role would the NRI community play in shaping U.S.-India diplomatic relations post-Trump's win?
I'm not sure I am best placed to answer that. Obviously, I think my two co-panelists would know a lot more about that. One of the things I've just observed is just the growing number of Indians and people of Indian origin, and in successive the national security and foreign policy establishment under both Republican and Democratic administrations. In the 1990s, there were very few of them, and they all knew each other. There were only a handful. But today, even in the first Trump term, certainly in the Biden administration, there were just a very large and growing number of people of Indian origin in key roles, not all of them having to do directly with India, but many of whom had prior experience with India, had personal connections. And that's, I think, is likely to continue, maybe to a lesser degree, but it'll certainly continue under a Trump administration. But I think others would be better placed to answer that.
Yeah, and then over to you, Shekhar and Niraj, the same question.
Yeah, I may be similarly disadvantaged. I don't know for sure, and nobody does, but I would argue that there are Indian Americans, very prominent ones, who supported Trump. He likes loyalty. He likes the Indian diaspora. He has tweeted about it. So I would just assume, just as Dhruva said, there were plenty of Indians in the Biden administration. There were in the first Trump administration in the White House. I would assume they will be there. And if they are, that's the access point for NRI engagement. That isn't the way that necessarily policy gets made if you're sitting in the White House in a staff position, but you have an access point. And if you have an access point, it just simply means that you have the ear of the establishment and you can talk to the right people. So it also depends to some extent on India, right? And I would think that the Indian ambassador here, the Prime Minister, certainly believes that the diaspora is pretty critical as a link. And if they choose to use it that way, they will pay attention in the State Department and in the White House to the Indian diaspora. But I can't tell you I know who the whisperers are going to be, because there'll be a lot of wannabes, I'm sure, Niraj, who claim to have us here or were in Mar-a-Lago sitting right next to him, I'm sure, when he declared victory or whatever. But I doubt that there are that many that are that close. But I have met a few who I would say are substantive and probably have real access.
Niraj?
Yeah, look, I think the diaspora is ever growing, and let's not sort of glaze over the diaspora's connection to Congress. Obviously, the Trump administration extremely important, but also Congress is very important, and there are growing numbers of Indian Americans with strong relationship with Republican members of Congress. But yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of Indian Americans, just as there were in Trump's first term, be in Trump's second term. Kash Patel, who was chief of staff at the DoD, will likely play a prominent role amongst many, many others. And look, I think one thing that we have not talked about that really has not been in the media was during the convention, but the second lady is going to be an Indian American. The kids of the vice president are Indian American. that just from a cultural standpoint will rub off, right? Because President Trump will be spending that much time with an Indian American, and so I think we should not forget Usha's role here insofar as exposure to the culture and to we as Indian Americans. But look, I think a lot of this will be seen. They're named a chief of staff today, and many will be many other positions will be named in the days and weeks to come.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point about Usha Vance too. And amongst his advisors and close kin and donors, he's had that exposure to Indian Americans as well. So keeping with that, Sanjeev actually has a really good question in the chat, and really open it up to any of you, Dhruva, Niraj, or Shekhar. Particularly first pointed towards you, Niraj, because you'd mentioned the economy. And so he says that, inflation was obviously a big issue in this election. And Niraj, you mentioned that, Trump will focus on that. We all know that that is going to be one of the first things that he's going to tackle. But how much can a president really control inflation? The larger impact comes from the central bank's monetary policy. We know that Chairman Powell has said that he's not going to resign. But of course, there's going to be a change in the administration. So how much impact can the U.S. president play on that, on inflation?
Well, I think, yes, sure, we can talk about the central bank, but look, there is no dispute that federal spending has a direct impact on inflation. And we can look at what President Biden spent more than any president in U.S. history with the America Rescue Plan, with his Build Back Better plan, with the infrastructure bill. All of these things have to be reined in. The federal debt has just ballooned to trillions and trillions of dollars, and so federal spending. Can the president just control that? No, because Congress controls spending. The president presents a budget, so yes, he is a significant part of that, but also Congress has to agree. But reining in federal spending is incredibly important, and then stirring economic growth. We saw very little stagnant economic growth in Biden's term. Obviously, we believe that extending the Trump tax cuts will be good for the economy. Getting the regulatory environment under control will help the economy, and economic growth will result in a healthier economy for everyone. But look, federal spending has to get under control. This is not something that was even discussed in the last 4 years under President Biden, and I think will be a major issue for the Congress and for President Trump in this term.
Count me, Neha, in the truly skeptical column here. Like, I will take serious wagers on the fact that federal spending does not go down one dime in the next 4 years. Niraj is right. It's the Congress and it's the president, and you only have like a year to do this because then you have an election coming up in 26. During Trump's first term, partly because of COVID, the deficit actually went up 8 trillion. It went up in the 4 years without COVID, or to some extent with a little bit of COVID spending, 4 trillion. So, I mean, Trump has spent as much money or more than any president, but some of that was due to the crisis we faced. Economic growth is sluggish, but it's not like it's 2.2%. We have unemployment at 4.1%. I think essentially he's inheriting an okay economy. He may not have called it that by any means. You're running a campaign. You have to present very dark pictures about your opponent. But the bottom line is, if the true problem is deficit spending, which I agree, by the way, as a business guy, I have been saying that a deficit that's 110% of GDP is unsustainable. It is completely unsustainable. That's why whatever the Fed does, they can do, but they're tinkering with short-term rates. The mortgage rate is set by the 10-year Treasury, which has gone up since the election or re-election of Trump. So the bottom line is, what are you going to do about that? You have to cut deficit. You have to do deficit spending cuts. To do cuts, you would have to cut domestic spending, defense spending, Social Security. Ain't no chance in my lifetime that any of that's going to happen. Bottom line.
Yes. I'm just looking at another thing. Speaking of COVID and that, also impacting the globe, I'll ask all of you this, and if you can just focus just 2 minutes on this. Which emerging global issue do you think could unexpectedly demand U.S. attention, in the coming year, regardless of current policy priorities?
I think
I'll open it
China,
up to-
Taiwan,
yeah.
Dhruva, I think the South China Sea is where the first problem will occur. And if it's a challenge, there would be the most direct challenge that President Xi could make.
Yes, so I think there's a long-term. I mean, I think the Taiwan contingency is in some ways the most pointed one, but there is a long-term structural competition with the U.S. and between the U.S. and China, and there'll be a question about how to manage that and how much Trump chooses to prioritize. How much? I mean, again, there will be an impulse in some quarters to cut a deal, whatever that looks like, with China. But again, that was tried in 2017. There was a Mar-a-Lago summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. And then because Trump perceived that China did not live up to its end of the bargain, we saw a very dramatic shift between about March of 2017 and September of that year towards a much more strident China policy. I don't know what those unknowns are. There's always the concern about another pandemic, about sort of economic malaise, so global, driven by complex circumstances. Something similar to what we saw in 2008, 7, 8, 9. I mean, those are some. There's a geopolitical competition increasing. I think one thing that doesn't get enough attention is we're sort of in a new nuclear race and a space race as well, which is related to that. So that getting out of hand is something that I think does not get sufficient attention. The disruptive effects of technology, AI safety standards is something where there's been very minimal cooperation, global cooperation on that. And again, a lot of it is in the private sector, and there are even questions about how much AI countries even want to regulate AI, and I think that will be one of those issues that will feature. I just want to get, while it's not my area of competence, I'm not an economist, I do think there are two external dimensions to the inflation question, though, that I just want to quickly address. Two factors certainly will be immigration and tariffs. And again, why I'm not, I don't know, I don't think it is just campaign rhetoric, but I think the Trump administration will find, while there is an impulse to apply those tariffs, or at least use those as a negotiating tactic with particularly China, and to stem legal migration, that doing so in a manner that is very dramatic will add to those inflationary measures. And again, in 2 years, there will be midterms. 4 years from now, there will be another presidential election. So I do think more than any kind of other factors, that will have to force a kind of at the very least, a sort of calibrated application of some of these measures. And I mean, I'm talking more on the legal migration side. I think for the question of undocumented workers, I think Mr. Narasimhan was completely correct. So I do think that there is that external dimension on both trade and immigration policy that is tied very much to the inflation question as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Dhruva. And Niraj, for you, what would you say is emerging global issue?
Yeah, I think, China, I don't know that that's one that we don't know about. Obviously, we know about, the China issue and Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Gaza. As far as what would be unexpected, I don't know that any of us are Nostradamus and can predict that. Certainly there will be, but I think, look, there is, and I know Shekhar will disagree with me, but when President Trump was president the first time, a lot of our adversaries understood the consequences of acting. They did not feel that way clearly while Joe Biden was president. And so, I do think, President Trump provides a more sort of intimidation factor to our adversaries to say, look, we will not be messed with. You will not do things against our interests. That is not something that Hamas or Russia took very seriously under President Biden. And so I think, we look at that, I think, Dhruva was correct as far as NATO and some of these other global alliances. We're going to want our allies to step up more monetarily in particularly. And so I think, we're going to see some of our allies pressed to do more, but I think that's a good thing.
In terms of, the intimidation factor, I mean, how does that impact our relationship, with our allies? Because that's across the board. Like you're saying, they're asking to, pay their fair share, but what is that actually, the consequences for that?
Well, our allies should pay more in these global alliances. We pay an inordinate amount more than our allies in terms of per capita GDP. But look, we again have a map of the 4 years of the Trump presidency of peace and prosperity. And look, I think the main global issues, other than China, that have to be reined in are the Ukraine-Russia war and the Israel-Hamas conflict. And I think those are going to be the world's priorities. I think we know where President Trump stands on those. And I think there's going to be a lot of focus. There are still American hostages that Hamas has that we need to be returned. People don't talk about that. And so I think you're going to see President Trump rally our allies and the globe to solve these conflicts.
And do you think that, given that it's a second term, there's going to be more of this intimidation or more of,
well, let me just clarify the word. Let me just clarify the word intimidation. President Reagan would say, speak softly and carry a big stick. That's what, President Trump does. It's clear that in the 4 years that, President Biden was president, that, our adversaries didn't respect us or our authority. Russia never would have invaded Ukraine under a President Trump. They did under President Biden. Hamas never would have attacked Israel under a President Trump. They did under President Biden. And so, carrying that big stick is something that we're going to return American leadership to under President Trump.
So Neha, let me disagree with Niraj, as he expects me to here. I think it is not neither intimidation nor a big stick. Quite bluntly, it's unpredictability. If you don't know how the other person is going to behave, you tend to worry about them a lot more. And a lot of people wake up in the morning going, what the heck's he going to say now or do next? It may have worked, but there's literal zero empirical proof that if Trump had been president, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. They were plotting that and planning it for 3.5 years, well before Biden got into office. Same thing with Hamas. Hamas plotted and was doing training outside the kibbutzim for about 3 years before they actually came across the border. So what would have been the big difference? The difference is that Biden went and rallied the NATO allies. They all got together. They actually started helping Ukraine stem the fact that they were about to take Kiev in 12 hours was the expectation that Russia would overrun the capital of Ukraine. I think that some of this is just talk and bombastic. We'll see what happens. Having a change of administration that occurs peacefully in the United States, number one, is a pretty good thing. Number two, having one party in control, in my view, hey, let them have it. Let's see what they can actually do. All this talk about I could have solved this problem are done. Now go actually solve the problem. Let's see what happens. Proof is in the pudding.
Right. And to your point, Shekhar, I think we've heard, President Trump say that, President-elect Trump or President Trump, I don't know what the right term, say that, even before he would get into office, that he would end this war within 24 hours. So, hopefully that is something that, he's able to do before he gets into office. But staying on the global scale, there's a good question here from Mahesh Patel, who says that, how do we see India-Canada-US Triangle relationship under Trump administration? And Dhruva, if I can give that over to you.
I think that that's a good question. Short answer is we don't know. I noticed some of my friends in Canada made note of the fact that Trump spoke to Modi before he spoke to Trudeau. And so there was some concern that this indicates that he might be more persuaded by India on some of the differences that have emerged between India and Canada. But look, I think one is what has happened between India and Canada is very much a political issue at this point of time, and really is very much influenced by a political disagreement at the highest levels that has infiltrated now into the bureaucracies of both countries. And it's very hard to anticipate sort of constructive disengagement, if you will, or a resolution on some of these matters, as long as as long as we have these two leaderships in India and Canada. So I think it will require an election in one or either country for things to change and become maybe reset those relations. I think with the US, I think it's much more so far this has been dealt with in a sort of legal manner, that it's been much more mature in the handling of it. There's been information exchange at every level. And so I think the US has found itself in the last year or so caught between wanting to preserve this relationship with India that is growing, and then this need to stand by one of its closest allies. It's one of its largest trade partners, in a NATO ally, a Five Eyes country in Canada, and it's been caught between these two impulses, and is sort of hopeful that the US and Canada can work. India and Canada can work some of this out bilaterally. I just think we've not seen that progress. Now, will Trump's election and a feeling, perhaps a feeling in Canada that Trump doesn't care enough about this, will that lead to, again, both sides working more constructively towards finding social agreement? I mean, it should not be the case that India and Canada have worse relations today than India and Pakistan or India and China, but at least diplomatically that is the case today. So again, maybe the sort of a Trump election will be the catalyst that enables that kind of serious and sensible conversation to happen between Ottawa and New Delhi, but let's see. I just want to clarify, because there was a question on it on legal migration. I worried that I maybe sounded too optimistic or too sanguine. There are going to be changes to legal migration as well. I do think, what we saw in the first Trump administration was, amongst other things, simply a gutting of funding to USCIS, to the State Department to process visas. This led to a months, sometimes years-long backlog for visa processing for Indians to come to the US, and one that the Biden administration, to their credit, actually spent some effort at trying to reduce those times. It still is very difficult today for first-time Indian businessmen and business people to come to the US for regular work, for tourists to come, for students. So that was an effect of the first Trump administration. I just think their hand will be stayed a little bit, or will be moderated by other compulsions, including trying to bring a lot of technology manufacturing to the US, something that this will be a much more tech-friendly, I think, government than the first Trump administration. It'll be moderated by concerns about inflation. So I think the best is not that there won't be any changes to legal migration at all. I think that is on the cards very much. It is a priority of the incoming administration in the US. The question is, can it be done in a manner that is calibrated, thoughtful, and with due process, rather than simply gutting funding? And on that I'm a little bit more, at this point of time, a little bit more sanguine.
Right, and to that point, there's a question in the chat, Niraj, I think specifically for you about legal immigration. And I think you mentioned that it's going to be relatively unaffected, and the focus is going to be more on the border and illegal immigration. And Vinay says that there is a proposal to pause unaccepted applications for categories of immigration, large backlogs, asylum, employment-based green cards. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to disagree that there will be major changes in legal immigration. I don't think there will be. Again, I think there's only so much oxygen that anyone has to breathe, and that oxygen is going to be economically focused. It's going to be, border focused, illegal immigration focused. If there is something done on the legal immigration side, it would, major changes would have to go through Congress. Congress is something that they've been unable to do for decades. It is unlikely, even with a trifecta, that all Republicans will agree. You still have, someone like a Susan Collins and Lindsey Graham in the Senate who are much more, moderate. But look, I think the sort of conservative attitude towards legal immigration is to go from chain migration to more of a merit-based system, which I think would actually benefit Indians trying to come to the US if there is a change from chain migration to a merit-based system. But again, that would take, congressional authority. Some of these visa things, a lot of them was during COVID. COVID, they shut down a lot of these processing centers. That will not be the case in this Trump presidency, right? Unless hopefully we don't have another COVID here. But look, I just don't see this as something there's a priority. I think the question in the chat linked an article from The Verge, which is a very liberal, progressive media outlet. Just because one think tank has a proposal doesn't mean that this is the administration's proposal. We saw, in the first Trump presidency, Tom Cotton did have an immigration reform bill that sort of switched from chain migration to more a merit-based system. I imagine that he will introduce that once again, but I don't know that will make much progress. President Biden had 4 years to reform immigration. He did not do that or really even propose any legal immigration changes. And so I really just don't foresee the Congress being able to get that done in the timeline when there are so many other pressing issues that face the country, in particular illegal immigration. I don't see a bill being able to get through Congress that makes significant changes on the legal side of the immigration equation.
Great. Shekhar, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to address a question about Canada and what could be done. I mean, even in a transition. I mean, right now, I would encourage President-elect Trump to call up Prime Minister Trudeau and say, go do something about the fact that there are significant issues in your country with regard to Khalistani elements. I mean, he could do that today. He could make that call. He could also make a call to Bibi Netanyahu and say, hey, we need, people are starving in Gaza, and that is causing huge humanitarian issues. Do something about it. So in my view, there are things that even a president-elect in a transition can do that protect human lives, that also protect the sanctity of sovereignty in other countries. But the thing that I hope they don't do is listen to people like Stephen Miller on immigration, because if they do, then we're going to see a heck of a lot of drop in even legal immigration, much less. And a lot of this can be done by executive order. I mean, Biden proposed comprehensive legislation, never going to happen. I think Trump is not going to do that either. But I do think there can be things done by executive order that are pluses, and there are things that can be done that are minuses. I would hope that the pluses will outweigh the minuses, but I don't remain hopeful on immigration whatsoever.
And that certainly is a very hot button issue, and I know that there's folks on here that feel strongly one way or the other. I do see that we are coming up on the hour. I just want to give the three of you a very quick closing remarks that you may have for us. Niraj, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you to Indiaspora for hosting this. I think it's important to get this from the Indian American perspective. Always great to be with my friend Shekhar, though we disagree on virtually everything. He's still a good friend and a great political mind. And Dhruva, it's great to meet you and wish you much success. Look, I know many people were surprised that President Trump won, that we took the Senate, that will likely keep the House. I was not. We saw this. Look, I think that we saw an abundance of peace and prosperity during President Trump's first term. I think that is the goal of his second term, to restore that peace and prosperity. And I think insofar as the U.S.-India relationship, I think that will be critical. I think Shekhar's right that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have a great relationship that will hopefully lead us to a stronger U.S.-India relationship, and I know I will do my part. So thank you very much, and look forward to the next 4 years.
Thank you, Niraj, for all that you're doing and elevating, the profile of the Indian American community with a lot of firsts. So really appreciate that. And Shekhar, over to you.
Sure, just 30 seconds. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Indiaspora. I think these are healthy conversations. They should happen. And to Niraj's point, we probably disagree on a whole lot of stuff, but I still respect the other point of view. And look, he's going to be the president of the United States. I hope he wants to be president of all the people, and I hope he isn't as nutty as he was the first time around. And if he behaves well and does the things he promised, and he does bring peace and prosperity, more power to him. And we should all stand by and pray and hope that that happens.
Shekhar, and the key word is healthy, and not just healthy dialogues, but healthy policies for the country that's best for all Americans. And Dhruva, lastly to you.
I guess I have the final word. So first of all, I want to extend my thanks to Indiaspora, to Neha, to Sanjeev, MR, and others who've built up a great organization and a great network that is not just across the US, but across the world in many different countries, and so really encouraging. But you also channel the energy and success of the Indian diaspora, and I think it's quite remarkable that we had we have a situation. I mean, for what is less than roughly 1% of the population of the US, where you had one presidential candidate who was half Indian and whose mother was born in India. You have another ticket where the next second lady will be from of Indian origin. There were at least 4 NRI, people of Indian origin who were in the running for cabinet or being considered for cabinet positions. If had Kamala Harris won, there are possibly 2 or 3 who are in contention for cabinet level posts in the event Trump wins. So, I mean, that really is a reflection of the success and strength of the Indian diaspora here, and not just in one realm in politics, but you go through business, entertainment, and it really is quite remarkable. I often get questions from other Asian, particularly officials and people from those countries who are just sort of quite blown away by the fact that Indian Americans are so well represented at the upper echelons of the U.S. government. But I just want to end on this note that we're in for some bumps in the road. We're going to see some disruptions domestically, socially, internationally over the coming months and years. And the Indian American community and the Indian diaspora generally has this ability to play a remarkable stabilizing role in this disruptive world. So I do think we should all continue to be engaged on these kinds of conversations over the coming 4 years. So that's the note I would want to end on.
Dhruva, that's a lovely note. Very positive, and I think that despite our differences, I think you make a very good point that we're becoming very prominent in this country. We're making our mark. We're making a difference, and despite which side of the aisle we're on, we're raising our profile. So I'm going to turn it over to Shobha, but I cannot thank you enough, Shekhar, Dhruva, and Niraj. This has been exciting for me. I'm a political junkie, so really it's been fascinating to have you. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Shobha.
Thank you. What a fantastic panel. For multiple reasons, you have brought back my faith in recent dialogue. I think it was great to have you all have a balanced conversation on topics that are of great interest to all of us. And after all the zooming in that happened in the last few days in terms of stats and counties, I thought the zooming out and talking about domestic policy, bipartisan relationship, global context of the US elections, it was a fantastic context-setting reminder of what we have been through and what lies ahead. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, all our team who put this together, and so glad that those of you who are here could join us. Thank you.